I never thought I'd be telling this story at 72. Emma was with me for 50 years of creating a life, a family, seeing more ups and downs than I can remember. I remember the night we met. We met at a local dance hall when she was 19, I was a couple of years older. She had a rare kind of beauty that punches you in the chest, the kind you remember for a lifetime. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was wearing a simple blue dress. When I asked her to dance, the world around us faded, and from that point on I was sure she was my future. We married young, hoping for all that youth brings, and all that dreams can accomplish. We didn't have much, but we didn't know it. So we moved into a small apartment with barely enough room to turn around, but to us it was a palace. Every corner was a story, every piece of furniture was a story, every corner was filled with laughter and late nights planning our lives. Emma juggled her job in the house, and I worked long hours at work, trying to build a future. We did. We did face challenges together over the years. We had kids, bought our first house, got older, watched friends come and go. Every year was something different. I believed, with all my heart, that Emma and I were unbreakable, and through it all. Of course we had our share of arguments and there were times when we would sort of drift apart, but we always made our way back. She was more than my wife, and she was my partner, my best friend. They talk of growing old together as if it's just a part of life, but never mention the quiet strength that it actually takes to do that. To wake up every day and decide to keep building the life I've built with someone. Emma and I did that, every day, for 50 years. I knew we'd stay that way, two people connected by something almost holy, and as time passed, I was sure of it. Now, however, I look back and see that I was blind. Life has a habit of dragging you in all directions at the same time, and if you're not careful, you let go of the things you should have held onto the most tightly. Now I can see that at some point I lost her. It was there in the signs, tiny things, fleeting moments when she appeared far away, or focused on something else. I ignored them though, we were too confident in what we'd built. I didn't think this kind of thing could happen to us, I thought it could happen to friends of ours, but not us. After 50 years of life together, not. I think the first time I noticed something was off was around our 45th anniversary. By then, I had retired and settled into a quiet life around the house, puttering around in the garden, tackling those home projects I never had time for before. Emma, though, she was still working, still keeping herself busy with friends and volunteering. I admired her for that. I remember thinking, she's got so much more energy than I do. But slowly, that energy turned into something I didn't recognize. She started coming home later, especially on days she said she'd been volunteering. At first, it made sense to me. She'd get caught up at the hospital, or someone from her volunteer group would invite her to coffee afterward. But then it became more frequent, and she'd be so different. I don't know how to describe it, but she seemed almost distracted, lost in thought, even when she was right there next to me. Once, she came home with her hair freshly done and wearing a new dress I hadn't seen before. She looked beautiful, and I told her so, but when I asked where she'd been, she just laughed and said, "Oh, just with the girls." I smiled, but something felt wrong. It was in the way she laughed, maybe a little too hard, her voice too light, like she was trying to steer me away from asking more. I didn't press. I trusted her. Then, one Saturday afternoon, she told me she was going to a friend's house to help organize some charity event, and she'd be home by dinner. But dinner came and went, and still, no sign of Emma. I must have checked my watch 100 times. When she finally came through the door, well past 10, she looked flustered, almost like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. I asked if everything was all right, and she just mumbled something about losing track of time. I let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. And so the days went on. I tried to brush off my suspicions, told myself I was just imagining things. But it was always there, that gnawing feeling in the back of my mind, growing a little stronger each time she pulled away. It was like I was watching the woman I loved drift into a fog, and no matter how hard I reached, I couldn't bring her back. I think, in some way, I was afraid to know. Afraid of what I might find if I started asking too many questions. After all, we'd been through 50 years together, what was there to question? But as much as I tried to ignore it, that quiet distance between us only grew wider. And little by little, the life we'd built together started to feel like a memory, slipping through my fingers like sand. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine. 50 years together don't just dissolve, it doesn't happen overnight. It was probably the routine of it all, the comfort that, for so long, I thought would last forever. We had our traditions: Saturday morning breakfasts, Sunday drives, evening walks in the park. Those were our rituals, the little stitches holding us together. But in the months after her late nights and strange excuses began, I felt those stitches start to unravel, one by one. I started noticing Emma's absence more than her presence. Every time she'd leave the house, a pang of worry gnawed at me, though I tried to bury it. I never wanted to be that suspicious husband, the kind who doubts his wife without reason. And I had no reason to doubt her, not really. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, I asked her if everything was all right. She looked at me, startled, and I could see something flicker in her eyes, maybe surprise, maybe something else. "Of course," she said, too quickly, before glancing down at her plate. Her tone was light, almost rehearsed. "Why wouldn't it be?" she added, her voice steady, but her fingers drumming a little too fast against her glass. I shrugged, not wanting to press, but my mind kept spinning. It was in those moments, like that quiet dinner, where the silence spoke louder than any words. The conversations we used to have, the ones that stretched late into the night, were gone, replaced by small talk and one-word answers. It was as if we were strangers sharing the same house. I remember one night in particular. She was out again, late, and I was sitting in the darkened living room, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked with an urgency that echoed my racing thoughts. When she finally walked through the door, I saw her hesitate, just a slight pause as she took off her coat. There was something in her face, a softness, almost like regret, but she quickly masked it, smiling that same, distant smile she'd been giving me for months. The next day, I found myself doing something I never thought I'd do. I opened her calendar on the desk in our study. It was something I would have never touched before, not because it was private, but because I trusted her. And that trust had always been enough. But now, as I thumbed through the pages, looking for any clue, any sign of where she was going, my hands shook. It was a painful realization, standing there with her calendar in my hands. I didn't find anything, not that day. But it was that first crack in the wall I'd built around my doubt, the first moment I allowed myself to think, maybe I didn't know her as well as I thought. It hurt to even think it. The tension grew in those following weeks, the kind that weighs heavy on your chest and sits in the pit of your stomach, gnawing away. We still went through the motions, at dinners, a few laughs here and there, our familiar routines. But something vital was missing. It was like I was holding my breath, waiting for her to open up or to explain all the time she'd been spending away. She didn't. And that silence said more than I was ready to hear. I decided, one evening, that I couldn't bear the waiting any longer. I had to know. I'm not proud of it, but I did something I thought only other people did, something I'd once said I'd never do. I went through her things, carefully, quietly, just to see if there was something, anything that could explain this distance. Her drawers were in order, her closet neat as always. But in her purse, hidden in a small side pocket, I found a hotel keycard. The sight of it hit me like a punch. A hotel? Why would she have that? I turned the card over in my hand, a heavy pit forming in my stomach. I tried to imagine a reasonable explanation, something innocent, something I could believe. Maybe she'd just forgotten about it. But the thought seemed hollow. Emma wasn't careless like that. She never was. That night, she came home late again. I sat in the kitchen, waiting in the shadows, turning that keycard over and over in my hands until I heard the door creak open. When she walked into the kitchen, she looked surprised to see me. I held up the card, my hand trembling. "What's this, Emma?" My voice sounded foreign to me, quieter, raw with all the worry I'd kept buried. Her eyes widened, but then she looked away, refusing to meet my gaze. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally said, "It's nothing, really." She tried to smile, but it fell flat. I must have picked it up by mistake. She brushed it off, as if I was supposed to believe that it was nothing. But the way her voice wavered, the way her eyes wouldn't settle on mine, it all felt wrong. There was a weight in her silence, one that confirmed my worst fears more than words ever could. That night, lying awake beside her, I stared up at the ceiling, my mind a blur of questions. Who was she meeting? Why was she there? My heart pounded, and I felt trapped in my own home, a stranger beside me in the bed we'd shared for 50 years. The questions echoed in my mind, relentless, refusing to let me sleep. I knew, in that moment, that life as I knew it was slipping through my fingers. After that night, something shifted in me. The woman I had loved for 50 years, my best friend, now felt like a stranger. I'd always thought of her as steady, constant, the same Emma I fell in love with all those years ago. But each day, the person beside me in bed seemed more like someone I'd once known than the woman I'd shared my life with. Memories of us kept surfacing, clashing painfully with the distance I now felt. I found myself slipping back to the early days, memories that had always brought me comfort. I thought about the long nights we'd spent talking in that first cramped apartment, dreaming of our future together. I remembered the nights we'd lie awake, laughing at nothing and everything, feeling like we had all the time in the world. But those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Sitting across from her at the dinner table, I found myself searching for the woman I'd known. Her smile was still there, but now it seemed more like a mask, one she wore to keep me from seeing the truth. And that realization, that I might never truly know her again, cut deeper than any argument or fight ever could. One evening, as she was leaving the house, she barely looked me in the eye, mumbling something about helping a friend with errands. She didn't kiss me goodbye, didn't even pause at the door like she used to. I stood there, watching her go, feeling a hollow ache in my chest, a silent question repeating over and over, where did we go wrong? In that moment, I made a silent vow to find out the truth. Because whatever was going on, I couldn't live with half-truths and empty goodbyes. After all we'd built, I needed to know what had gone so terribly wrong. And if she wouldn't tell me, I'd have to find out on my own. A week passed, each day a haze of suspicion and unease. Emma seemed to sense it too, the distance between us growing larger with every late night, every excuse that seemed emptier than the last. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. I'd spent 50 years trusting her, but that trust felt shattered, and I didn't know how to put it back together without answers. One evening, she mentioned she'd be going out to meet her volunteer group for dinner. The moment she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her out, keeping a distance as I drove. I felt a mixture of shame and resolve. I hated what I was doing, hated what I had become. But the need to know the truth overpowered everything else. Emma drove across town, finally pulling into the parking lot of a restaurant I'd never seen before. I parked a few spots away, close enough to see her but far enough that I could stay unnoticed. I watched as she walked inside, glancing over her shoulder in a way that made my heart pound. She wasn't looking for me specifically, but there was a certain nervousness in her, like she was hiding something. A few minutes later, a man entered the restaurant. He was maybe a few years younger than me, tall, with an easy confidence in the way he moved. Emma smiled when she saw him, a warm, familiar smile, one I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I felt the air leave my lungs as I watched them greet each other. They hugged briefly, and I saw her face light up in a way that both angered and devastated me. I sat there, hands clenched around the steering wheel, feeling as though I'd been punched in the gut. Everything I'd feared was coming true before my eyes. They sat down at a table near the window, leaning in close, speaking in hushed tones. I could see her laughing, touching his arm, the way she used to touch mine. It was like watching my life unravel in real time. 50 years of marriage, of promises, slipping away in the dim light of that restaurant. For a moment, I wanted to burst in, to confront them both and demand answers. But I couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, my mind a blur, my heart shattering with every passing second. After what felt like hours, they got up, and I watched as he walked her to her car. She hugged him again, and this time, there was a look in her eyes I couldn't ignore, a tenderness, a warmth I hadn't seen in far too long. When she finally drove away, I stayed behind, letting the silence sink in. I knew there would be no going back from this. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a hollow ache settle deep in my chest. The images of Emma with that man played over and over in my mind, each one sharper than the last. I could still see her smile, hear her laugh, feel the ease in her every movement as she sat across from him. She looked like the Emma I used to know, but it wasn't me who'd brought that light to her face. By morning, I felt like a shell of myself. I went through the motions of our usual routine, made coffee, straightened up around the house, sat in my favorite chair by the window. But everything felt off, wrong. The life we'd built together felt like it was closing in around me, suffocating and cold. When Emma finally came downstairs, she looked at me with that same distant smile, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, almost casual, like any other morning. But I couldn't return the greeting. I could barely look at her without the memories from the night before crashing back. "Emma," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." She looked up at me, her expression shifting slightly, but still controlled. She set her coffee cup down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "All right," she replied calmly, but I could see a flicker of something, maybe fear, maybe guilt, behind her eyes. "I know," I said, feeling a tremor run through me. "I saw you last night. I followed you." For a moment, the color drained from her face, and she looked down, unable to meet my gaze. She took a deep breath, but she didn't deny it. She didn't try to explain, or brush it off as a misunderstanding. That silence, that heavy, damning silence, confirmed everything I'd feared. "How long, Emma?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. She sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "It's not what you think," she finally said, but there was no conviction in her words. She sounded defeated, like someone who'd been caught in a lie too big to cover. "We're just friends." The word friends sounded hollow, absurd even, given what I'd seen. "Friends?" I echoed bitterly, my voice rising. "Friends don't meet in secret and hide things. Friends don't take each other to hotels and lie about it." She flinched at that, looking away, but still, she said nothing. I could see her struggling, trying to find the words, but nothing she said would have made a difference. The damage was done. "After 50 years, Emma," I continued, my voice breaking. "After everything we've built, this is what it comes to? Secrets and lies?" She finally looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. But they only made me angrier. How could she be the one crying when she'd been the one tearing our life apart, piece by piece? "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." I shook my head, the pain and betrayal burning deep inside me. "Maybe that's the worst part, Emma," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "That it ever began at all." With that, I got up, leaving her sitting alone, her apology hanging in the air like a bitter reminder of everything I'd lost. I walked out the door, the weight of 50 years pressing down on me, feeling as though my life had shattered into pieces I could never put back together. After walking out, I drove aimlessly around town, unsure of where to go or what to do. The streets I'd known for decades seemed foreign, as if they belonged to a world I didn't recognize. I had nowhere to turn, nowhere I wanted to go. Every place I passed seemed to echo memories of Emma and the life we'd shared. Eventually, I pulled over at a small park near the outskirts of town. It was quiet there, just the distant sound of birds and a faint breeze moving through the trees. I sat on a bench, my mind replaying our confrontation over and over again. Her face when she realized I knew, the look in her eyes that was half guilt, half something else, resignation, maybe. And then those words she'd said, I didn't mean for it to get this far. The words haunted me, twisting the knife that was already lodged deep in my heart. Did that mean she'd planned to end it? Or that she'd never cared enough about what we had to stop it from happening in the first place? The questions spun in my mind, each one heavier than the last. I thought of all the moments we'd shared, all the memories we'd built. Our first home, our first child, every milestone and every hardship, they were the foundation of our life together, bricks we'd laid one by one, believing they'd last forever. But now, I wondered if those bricks were as solid as I'd once believed. Was our life just a house of cards, waiting to be toppled by the slightest breeze? As the hours passed, I realized I couldn't stay out there forever. Eventually, I'd have to go back, to face her, to face whatever came next. But the thought of returning to that house, to the weight of silence and the questions that hung in the air, felt almost unbearable. When I finally walked through the front door, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. But I felt nothing as I looked at her. The warmth, the connection we'd once shared felt cold, distant, as if a wall had risen between us that neither of us could cross. I didn't know if you'd come back, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. I almost didn't, I replied, feeling the weight of my words settle heavily between us. She looked down, twisting a tissue between her fingers. I didn't want this to happen, you know. I never meant to hurt you. Then why did you? I asked, the question coming out harsher than I intended. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to understand, needed something to make sense of the pain I was feeling. She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring at the table, as if the answer was buried somewhere in the wood grain. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. I don't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. Maybe I was just lonely. Maybe we both drifted without realizing it. The words stung, sharper than I expected. After 50 years, to hear that we'd somehow drifted apart without either of us noticing felt like an indictment of everything we'd built. But maybe she was right. Maybe we'd both let things slip, too comfortable in the life we'd built, too blind to see the distance growing between us. We sat there, the silence stretching out, filled with everything we couldn't say. And for the first time, I truly wondered if we could ever find our way back to each other, or if the life we'd built was beyond repair. In the days that followed, the house felt like a prison. The walls that had once held a lifetime of laughter and warmth now seemed to close in around us, trapping us in a silence neither of us knew how to break. We moved around each other like strangers, careful not to meet each other's eyes, each of us haunted by a pain too raw to voice. There was a new, unbearable awkwardness to our days. At breakfast, she'd pour my coffee out of habit, and then, catching herself, would stop and push the cup away. Little things I'd never noticed before suddenly felt overwhelming, the way she folded the towels, the sound of her footsteps down the hall. Every small reminder of her presence felt like a reminder of everything we'd lost, a constant reminder of how much had changed. One evening, I tried to talk to her, to break the silence that had settled like a heavy fog between us. Emma, I began, struggling to keep my voice steady. Do you want to fix this? Do you think it's even possible? She looked at me with tired, weary eyes, the light that used to dance in them now dimmed. For a moment, I thought she was going to say yes, that we'd try to find our way back to each other. But instead, she sighed and looked away. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if we can. Her words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth of them. maybe she didn't want to rebuild what we'd lost. Maybe the life we'd shared was as much of a stranger to her as it now felt to me. In the days that followed, I found myself lost in memories, clinging to them like a lifeline. I thought of our wedding day, the way she'd looked walking down the aisle, radiant with hope and love. I remembered the birth of our children, the late nights spent holding each other as we dreamed of the future. Those memories had always been a source of comfort, a reminder of everything we'd built together. But now, they felt like shards of glass, cutting deeper with every recollection. One afternoon, I went up to the attic, drawn by a need to escape, to find some small piece of the past that hadn't yet been tainted. As I sifted through old boxes, I came across a photo album, the one we'd made in the early years of our marriage. Each page was a time capsule, a glimpse into a life that felt worlds away. There was Emma, laughing beside me on a beach, her hair wild in the wind. There we were, holding our newborn son, our faces glowing with pride. There were the trips, the birthdays, the ordinary days captured in faded Polaroids. And as I looked through those pictures, I felt the weight of everything we'd lost settle over me, suffocating and cold. When I came back downstairs, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes distant. She looked up as I walked in, her gaze falling on the album in my hands. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe sorrow, in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. "Do you remember this?" I asked, my voice soft, almost pleading. She nodded, looking away. "Of course I do." "Then tell me," I said, unable to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Tell me how we got here. Tell me why, after 50 years, this is what we've become." She didn't answer. She just sat there, her silence saying more than words ever could. And in that moment, I realized that the Emma I'd known, the woman I'd loved for half a century, was gone. The life we'd built together had unraveled, leaving nothing but empty memories and the echo of what once was. The weight of that silence lingered in the air for days. Each time I tried to speak, to reach her, Emma would turn away, as though words could somehow worsen the damage. But for me, the unanswered questions were unbearable. I was haunted by them, unable to settle, my mind circling the same thoughts over and over, searching for meaning in what felt like a senseless betrayal. One afternoon, I decided I needed clarity. I walked into the living room where she was sitting, quietly flipping through a magazine, her face calm, almost serene. I took a seat across from her, waiting until she finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a kind of distant caution. "Emma," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I need to understand. After 50 years, I deserve to know why." She sighed, placing the magazine down with a slowness that felt intentional, as if she was stalling for time. Her gaze drifted out the window, far away, before she finally spoke. "I don't know, really. I wish I could give you a simple answer, something that would make sense." Her voice was tired, filled with a kind of weariness I'd never heard before. "But it isn't that simple. Sometimes things just drift." "Drift?" I repeated, disbelief sharpening my tone. "After 50 years, you calling it a drift? I've spent my whole life with you, Emma. I built a life with you. And you saying it just drifted away?" She flinched, as though my words had cut her, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. "I'm not saying it didn't matter. I'm just saying. I don't know when it happened, or how. But one day, I looked around and realized I'd lost parts of myself. Parts one thought I'd find elsewhere." Her words hung in the air like a final blow, filling the silence with a heavy, unspoken truth. She had felt lost, disconnected, and instead of turning to me, she had looked somewhere else. I could feel the ache in my chest growing, a dull, relentless pain, but I didn't let it show. "Did I fail you somehow?" I asked, my voice breaking despite myself. "Was there something I could have done?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It wasn't you, not really. It was me, needing to feel something different, something new. And I didn't know how to tell you. The emptiness in her voice was worse than any anger or resentment. She wasn't just confessing, she was admitting a kind of defeat, as if the love we'd shared had simply withered, slipping through her fingers like sand. I sat back, feeling as though a lifetime had drained out of me in those few minutes. For so long, I had thought love was something eternal, a bond that would hold no matter the trials, no matter the years. But now, I realized how fragile it could be, how easily it could be broken by silence, by the needs we never voiced, by the fears we let grow in the dark. When she looked at me again, there were tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know it would come to this." I stood up, suddenly feeling the need for space, for air. I couldn't sit there, listening to her apologies, hearing her explain something I couldn't fully understand. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her behind, a part of me wondering if we were finally, truly beyond repair. In the days that followed, I moved through our home in a daze. Every room, every piece of furniture, every small memento from our life together now felt weighted with memories, like ghosts lingering in the corners. It was as if I were living in a museum of our shared past, each item telling a story that no longer felt real. I tried to find ways to distract myself, but everything around me seemed to pull me back to thoughts of Emma, to questions that wouldn't let me rest. Our children called, sensing something in my voice but not pressing. I wanted to talk to them, to share my heartache, but a part of me couldn't bear for them to know the truth, not yet. They still saw us as a foundation, something secure and constant. What would it mean for them if they knew that foundation had cracked? Emma and I continued our strange dance around each other, neither of us brave enough to fully confront the fracture between us. She stayed home more often, perhaps feeling guilt, perhaps a sense of obligation. But I could see the restlessness in her eyes, a spark that I hadn't noticed before, as if she were already somewhere else, even when she was sitting right beside me. One night, I found myself standing by the window, looking out into the darkness, wrestling with a decision I hadn't thought I'd ever have to consider. Could I forgive her? Could I put the betrayal aside, and try to rebuild what we'd lost? I wanted to, desperately, but every time I thought of the way she'd looked at that man, the way she'd distanced herself from me, my resolve faltered. The trust that had been the foundation of our life together now felt irreparably shattered. It was past midnight when she came downstairs. I heard her soft footsteps behind me, felt her presence like a shadow. She stood beside me, silent for a moment, before finally speaking. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice tentative, as if afraid of my response. I nodded, though my heart pounded, uncertain of what I'd hear. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't expect you to understand. I don't think I even understand fully myself. But I don't want to let go of everything we've built. I don't want to end up strangers." Her words cut through me, a strange mix of hope and pain. I turned to face her, searching her eyes, looking for any trace of the woman I'd once known. "Then why did you turn away, Emma?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Why did you look for something, or someone else?" She looked down, her hands twisting together as if she were holding back tears. "I wish I had an answer that would make sense," she said softly. "Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I felt lost. But none of it takes away what we've shared, who we've been together. Can't we try to find a way back?" Her words hung in the air, filling the silence between us with a fragile kind of hope. I wanted to reach for it, to believe that somehow, after all the pain and betrayal, there was a path back to each other. But the wounds were still fresh, the trust between us broken. I looked away, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, Emma. I don't know if I can look at you the same way. I don't know if I can trust you." She reached for my hand, and for a brief moment, I let her hold it, feeling the warmth of her touch. But as the memories of her betrayal came rushing back, I pulled away, the pain too raw, too overwhelming. And in that moment, I realized just how deeply the rift between us ran. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. We'd agreed to try, to see if there was anything left to rebuild, but neither of us truly knew where to start. The routines we'd once shared now felt strange, filled with unspoken questions and wounds barely beginning to heal. Our conversations stayed superficial, weather, the news, updates about the children, but every word felt loaded, weighted with everything we weren't saying. Emma tried, in her own way, to show me that she was committed. She'd leave notes around the house, little reminders of things she knew I loved. One morning, I found a sticky note on the coffee pot with the words, "Thinking of you." Another day, she left a photo of us from one of our vacations, the edges worn and faded, with "Remember when" written on the back. They were small gestures, but I could tell they were her way of reaching out. And yet, every time I saw one, I felt a mix of longing and bitterness. I wanted to go back to when things were simpler, when love felt like something we could rely on, unbreakable. But the memories of her betrayal were still too fresh, too raw to ignore. One evening, I found her in the kitchen, cooking one of my favorite meals. She looked up when I entered, a hopeful smile on her face. For a moment, it felt like old times, like we were slipping back into the life we'd built together. "Smells good," I said, forcing a small smile as I took a seat at the table. She nodded, her smile widening just a bit. "Thought it might be nice to have a night like we used to," she replied, her tone tentative, almost as if she feared I'd reject her efforts. We ate in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable, yet wasn't easy either. It was as if we were both trying to find our footing, unsure of where the other stood, afraid of saying something that might shatter the fragile peace we were attempting to build. Halfway through the meal, she reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "For giving me this chance. I know it can't be easy." I didn't pull away this time. Instead, I held her gaze, feeling the weight of our history between us. "I don't know what's next," I admitted, my voice quiet. "But I'm trying. For both of us." We sat like that for a while, our hands joined, the silence filled with a tentative hope. It was a small moment, a tiny thread bridging the distance between us. But as much as I wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something new, I knew that the road ahead was long, and the pain still lingered, shadowing every step. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was something I'd have to choose every day, a slow, difficult process of rebuilding what had been broken. And though I wasn't certain if we'd ever truly find our way back, I knew that, for now, I was willing to try. In the following weeks, I learned just how complicated forgiveness could be. Each day felt like a delicate negotiation between my heart and my mind, as if I were carrying the past on one shoulder and the hope for our future on the other. Emma was patient, attentive in ways she hadn't been in years. She was there every morning, making coffee, asking if I wanted to go for walks, or suggesting we spend time on the hobbies we used to enjoy together. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memories of her betrayal. They lingered in quiet moments, creeping in at night as we lay side by side, our backs turned away from each other in the dark. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, to reach out and pull her close, but the pain and mistrust were like invisible walls. One Saturday, I found myself in the attic again, searching through old boxes. I came across our wedding album, buried beneath years of dust and memories. As I flipped through the pages, a rush of emotions washed over me, pride, nostalgia, and a deep, aching sorrow. In those photos, we were young, hopeful, our faces bright with love and the promise of a lifetime together. Emma found me there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the album open on my lap. She approached slowly, her face softening when she saw the pictures in my hands. She sat down beside me, close but not too close, respecting the boundaries we were still trying to define. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We were so happy." I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of everything we'd been through, every joy, every hardship, every painful revelation, sat heavy in the space between us. "Do you think we can ever get back to that?" I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I want to try. I want to rebuild this, if you'll let me." For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, fragile yet undeniable. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, to trust that we could somehow find our way back to each other. But I knew that it wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that would require both of us to confront our pain, our fears, and the deep wounds we'd left on each other's hearts. We sat there, side by side in the dusty attic, each lost in our own thoughts, each searching for a way to let go of the past and step into whatever future lay ahead. It was a quiet, fragile moment, but in that silence, I felt the first stirrings of something real, something worth fighting for. And though I didn't know what would come next, I knew that, for the first time since the betrayal, I was willing to take that first step. Emma and I began the long, awkward process of relearning each other, of stepping gently around the bruises we'd both left on our marriage. It wasn't easy. There were days when the doubts and memories would flood back, days when I'd see her smile and wonder if she'd ever smiled like that for him. But I kept reminding myself that, despite everything, I had chosen to try. For us, for everything we had built, and maybe even for everything we could still become. One night, Emma suggested we go out to the little Italian restaurant we'd loved in the early years of our marriage. I hadn't been there in ages, hadn't even thought about it in years. When we walked in, the place felt both familiar and new, like an echo of a different life. We took a table in the corner, where we'd always sat, and ordered the same dishes we used to order decades ago. For the first time in a long time, I saw her relax, her shoulders easing as we settled into conversation. We talked about the kids, our old friends, memories we hadn't visited in years. She laughed, the way she used to, and I found myself smiling in a way that felt genuine, unforced. For a few hours, the weight between us seemed to lift, replaced by something warm and light. We left the restaurant and walked along the quiet street, a gentle silence settling between us, comforting rather than strained. At one point, she reached for my hand, her fingers tentative but warm. I hesitated, the memories of betrayal flaring for a moment, but I allowed myself to stay in the moment. Her hand in mine felt familiar yet different, as though we were starting over, not from the beginning, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been cracked and now had a chance to heal. When we got home, I found myself standing in our doorway, unsure, caught between the past and a future I still didn't fully trust. She looked up at me, as if sensing my hesitation. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet plea for something more, something real. That night, we sat together in the living room, not saying much, just sharing the space, letting the quiet speak. And for the first time since all of this had begun, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. A chance to build something new, not on the ashes of what we'd lost, but on the deeper understanding we were slowly, painfully gaining. It wasn't a perfect night, and it didn't wash away the hurt. But it was a beginning, a fragile seed of trust planted in ground that had been scarred but, maybe, was ready to grow again. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that love, though changed, might find a way to survive. In the months that followed, Emma and I rebuilt our life piece by piece, day by day. It wasn't the same marriage, and it would never be the one we'd started with all those years ago. This was something different, a love touched by age, by disappointment and regret, yet somehow more honest for it. There were days when the past still haunted me, days when a look or a gesture would bring back the memories of her betrayal, like a shadow across our home. But those moments became fewer as time went on, replaced by small acts of kindness and understanding, by shared moments that brought a quiet kind of joy. I began to see Emma not as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone who had made mistakes, as we all do, and who was now walking beside me, trying, just as I was, to make things right. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box of old letters and notes we'd written each other during our early years. Some were simple notes, reminders of grocery lists or plans for the weekend. Others were small declarations of love, little promises we'd made when life was simpler, when we couldn't imagine anything coming between us. I took them downstairs and showed them to Emma. She read each one carefully, her eyes misting over as she smiled, sometimes laughed, at the words of our younger selves. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked, looking up at me with a softness in her eyes that reminded me of the woman I'd married. I thought about it, about everything we'd been through, all the ways we'd both changed, the pain we'd both endured. "I don't know," I replied honestly, reaching for her hand. "But I want to try. For as long as we have." And in that moment, I realized that maybe love isn't always about perfection, or even trust that never wavers. Maybe, as we grow older, it becomes something more resilient, something that can weather storms and still remain, even if it's a little bruised and scarred along the way. It's about choosing each other, over and over, even when the choice isn't easy. Emma squeezed my hand, her fingers lacing with mine, and we sat there, the past spread out before us, the future still unknown. But for the first time, I felt peace in that uncertainty. We would take it one day at a time, no longer expecting a fairy tale, but simply a love that could last, however imperfectly, through all the imperfections life could throw our way. In the quiet of that afternoon, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I found a new kind of forever. Not the one I dreamed of, but one I was willing to cherish, one I was willing to call my own.